Parker Molloy is an editor at large at Media Matters, and she's kind enough to join me on the Climate Pod now. Parker, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's so great to have you on. Like on the Climate Pod, we talk a lot about misinformation because there's so much like fossil fuel bullshit out there, and that's been really, really destructive to the climate movement. But it is so much broader than that when we talk about like how disinformation around climate actually works. And you could really see that in this Joe Biden meat ban. Meat contraband. I don't know if we have a name for this scandal yet, but
yeah, it's been interesting to follow this because I knew exactly how it was going to go. Basically, for people who aren't really aware, it's basically what happened was, so Joe Biden goes out and he announces his goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, based on, I think it was from the half from what it was in 2005, I think, right?
Yeah.
And the Daily Mail, of course, ran a story that took some unrelated research and an unrelated proposal and tied it to Biden's thing, which it wasn't.
Right.
And they ran a headline that said how Biden's climate plan could limit you to eat just one burger a month, cost $3,500 a year per person in taxes, force you to spend $55,000 on an electric car, and crush American jobs. It was a lot. And
how does something like this spread, right? Because the Daily Mail can pick it up. They obviously have a wide audience, but how does this get bigger than just a Daily Mail post?
Sure. Yeah. And this is kind of the cycle of right-wing misinformation, which tends to sort of happen. So you'll have something like the Daily Mail will say this. They'll connect these two things that aren't really related. But then you'll have someone like the Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, Donald Trump Jr., Marjorie Taylor Greene, and just others on the right who will kind of take that and just run with it, even though it's not accurate, not true. Donald Trump Jr. said, "I'm pretty sure I ate 4 pounds of red meat yesterday. That's going to be a hard no from me." I mean, that's, first off, that's a bad idea. It's weird. It's this weird sort of spite the, own the libs kind of, I will do the opposite of whatever you want me to do, rolling coal, that sort of thing. So it goes from there. And then, of course, it ends up on Fox News. And there it goes kind of mainstream. I mean, you had Fox's news side programming, America Reports with John Roberts and Sandra Smith, which they bill as news side, not opinion. They were rattling off this list of possibilities as though they were things that Joe Biden specifically was pushing, that he was advocating for, that he was saying, don't eat meat. We need to stop eating meat. Which, there are arguments to be made on that, but that's not what he was saying. And they just sort of ran with it. And the next day, then they had to kind of go on there and gently be like, yeah, a graphic in the script incorrectly implied that this was part of Biden's plan for dealing with climate change. That is not the case. And that was it. And then they moved on. But misinformation is it's frustrating. And we sort of saw this happen with the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Fox's coverage has been all over the place. They went from saying, oh, masks don't work, lockdowns don't work, and then they started doing this vaccine skepticism, and they were one of the ones who were pushing the hydroxychloroquine treatment that Trump was supportive of last year. So fighting misinformation is a real challenge, and it's extremely frustrating to have to spend so much time and energy trying to push back on things that are just obviously not true, and that I could make up something and take 2 minutes to do it, but then have to, if someone wants to try to debunk me, if I send it out to all my Twitter followers, they might have to spend 10 times as long trying to debunk me, and that only gets worse with more, larger and larger audiences. And places like Fox have gigantic audiences. It's that with great power comes great responsibility, but they're not being very responsible with it. So
Yeah, and it's like the thing that makes my like blood boil is this will happen on Fox News. But then it gets reported as, okay, there's this argument out there that this is what the Biden plan is going to do. And now the Biden administration has refuted that argument, right? As if it wasn't just a circle of bullshit that had just been widespread. And you and others talk about the Fox News cinematic universe. Like once it gets outside of that Fox News cinematic universe, which you write about all the time, that's where it's really, really bad, right? Because we're getting outside the right wing media echo chamber, and we're actually influencing how some regular people who might not have a partisan take might view this issue. That can get into people's heads, and they're thinking, okay, do I want to fight climate change or be able to have more than a hamburger a month? And
yeah.
it's just like that bizarre framing just makes my blood boil.
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean, what happens? And my most recent piece on this kind of deals with what I see as the larger issue here is that there's this fear in a lot of mainstream media that they'll be branded as liberals or biased towards the left or whatever it is, if they don't treat every single thing that if they don't treat every single thing that is being said by the right as though it's an entirely valid point. So the example that I saw that just made my head want to explode, because the day before this happened, as soon as I saw that, I said, one of the things that's going to happen is someone in mainstream media is going to take this, accept the premise at face value, and then like ask, huh, well, we have this argument, back and forth. And so what happened was Jennifer Jacobs, who's a reporter at Bloomberg, she tweeted after the White House tweeted a photo of Biden hovering over a grill to be like, look, he's fine with meat, basically. White House pushes back on claims Biden wants to steer Americans off meat with the pick of Biden in 2019 trying to win votes in first in the nation Iowa over various blah, 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 blah. And it's like, why? Why would you frame that as White House pushes back? And when it's really White House, just tears into ridiculous conspiracy theory. And then even there, you kind of get this thing where by pushing back on the false story, you end up having to accept the right-wing argument that no, we should not ban meat. We get to this point where you have to concede that, which is bad, and that was something that you saw during the campaign too, when it came to fracking. Biden had to keep going. No, I love fracking, not getting rid of fracking. And it's like, oh, okay, responding to a bad faith attack from the right. So yeah, so having to respond to bad faith arguments is unfortunately it forces you to accept them and engage with them. And there will always be people in mainstream media who use that and treat it like a completely valid point of view. And it feels like for the past few years, they've gotten better about this when it comes to climate change generally. But it's still not great. And it's also, it's not great when it comes to other issues as well, whether you're talking about COVID or civil rights or taxes or the economy. It's all kind of the same, and it's really frustrating to try to deal with. I used to make the joke that on Fox, you had someone like Shepard Smith, who was the closest thing that they really had to someone who was like an actual journalist, where I just imagined him walking into work every day thinking that he had an hour to try to undo 23 hours of nonsense. And that's kind of what I feel like my job ends up being, and what our job ends up being over at Media Matters, is this idea that we have to push back on all of this needless, pointless nonsense that's out there. The burger story is not even new. It's something that they've been pushing for years. I mean, it was in 2019 at the Conservative Political Action Conference. You had Sebastian Gorka, who was in the Trump administration. He was talking about how Democrats want to steal your burgers, and that was just the first step in the road to communism or something along those lines. And it was just kind of like all over the place. And then when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, introduced the Green New Deal, there was the same sort of thing there. You had them saying, well, they want to ban the combustion engine. They want to build a train to Hawaii. They want to, get rid of cows. It was this whole thing over and over of just nonsense that went on for months. And the advantage that they have is that when right-wing media want to cover something, they cover it nonstop, even when there's no real new news about it. And with the Green New Deal, when that first came out, there wasn't a lot of news that came out around it. It was, they introduced something. It was a simple, what was it, 7 pages?
A 13-page resolution
Yeah,
that no one read, that was covering it on right-wing media, right?
Exactly. They were basing it off of, someone made like a little joke in that, FAQ document. And that unfortunately kind of dominated the conversation. But yeah, no, they would go around just throwing out ridiculous estimates on the cost. And you had people going, well, it's going to cost $100 trillion. What are you talking about? It doesn't say anything about that. All the Green New Deal was, or is, I guess, is just kind of a non-binding commitment to do better. And,
right.
It shouldn't be controversial. But Fox really kind of poisoned the argument on that one. They really dominated it. I, at one point, had a mashup of Sean Hannity had a list of things that he would say, always in the same order. It was like, they're coming after cows and the combustion engine and planes and, all of this sort of stuff that was nonsense. But it was the fact that he was repeating himself over and over and over in the same exact order and saying the same exact story that I found really interesting, and kind of thought about the role that repetition plays in building a narrative. And you see that play out all over the place. And I think that's why I think Donald Trump was so successful as a, political candidate. He repeats himself. He says crooked Hillary. He says Lion Ted, make America great again. All of these things, these slogans that he just repeats over and over, fake news, they stick with people. And I think that that's one thing that, people on the left, or people concerned with accuracy and, how we talk about things, kind of sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot on, is just the fact that we know it sounds goofy to constantly repeat yourself, to constantly have a slogan, because people will be like, that's just a slogan. It's not anything that matters. And I really wish that there would have been a really quick, really accurate, detailed way to push back on the Fox News sort of lies that go with that. And I think that that's what's missing in a lot of these sort of conversations, is how do you push back against misinformation effectively?
Yeah.
Do you ignore it and hope it goes away? Because sometimes that is the answer. And other times it's the absolute worst thing you can do. And unfortunately, I don't really know.
Yeah, but I wonder, because this is, I'm not going to just flatter you here, but like your work and the work for Media Matters for America, you get a ton of traction online, and at least like I know you said like you knew this was going to happen and you knew the formula, and I feel like sometimes in your writing you almost got to feel like, oh my god, where I'm like I'm doing this formula, but it's the same thing happening over and over. It's like this right wing Groundhog's Day that I imagine you have to feel like sometimes in your writing. But it's so important because if you're not pushing back, if the Media Matters for America is not there pushing back, then it allows the conversation to shift in a way. And even now, like what I think of oftentimes what the sort of central aspect of climate discussion on mainstream media outlets is still this one of like, what are we losing? What does this cost? And it's just like because the other alternative, the actual right wing argument that's being made is just outright lies, it makes the center still very crazy. And if it's not for your work, I don't know who else is going to do that. So do you feel a sense of responsibility in that way because you're working for an organization that does get really good pickup and makes a difference?
Sure. I mean, I love the work we do, and I have long admired Media Matters generally before I worked there. That was one of the when I first started. It was great because it was already a site that I'd been reading for 10 years anyway. So I think it's effective if you can get through. And I think unfortunately there's a lot of some of the stuff I do is I write more narrative type pieces around a lot of the really great research stuff that we have. We have just really great, really smart people doing research, looking up how many times Fox mentions this or Breitbart mentions that or InfoWars, which that's always where I get very, very, very glad that I am not on the research team. These sorts of wild conspiracy theories and how to kind of fight back against them. And I feel like sometimes that sort of stuff can kind of seem like a thankless sort of job, the research aspect of it. Not, my job's great. I mean, I get to write and rant about things I really care about. And I do feel there's a sense of responsibility, but I think it's just something that people we should care about these things,
Yeah.
generally speaking. And I think that it's a lot of times people will look at stories that don't directly apply to them and think, well, why should I really care? Yeah, I know that's probably not super true, or yeah, I know that uh that's not technically accurate. You see that happen with a lot of discussions. And one thing that really kind of worries me when it comes to the way right-wing media controlled the conversation around COVID was that there was this, it should have been so easy to handle this, the reporting on it. It should have been something that brought people together. We can all agree that when your neighbors are dropping dead, and your family members are dying or getting sick and we can't go outside, that it's a bad thing and that we need to kind of come together and figure out what the smart thing to do going forward is. But as I was saying, Fox's COVID coverage was so all over the place,
Hmm.
so misleading, and continues to be to this day. You have people on there just trying to kind of sow vaccine misinformation, and over at the New York Post, they've been running all of these really scary, this person got a vaccine and then died kind of stories, which you want to be careful with how you report those out. With all of that, I worry about the future of how people will handle, or how not only how people are currently handling, but how people will in the future, discussions about climate change. I mean, it's something that happens slowly, and it's something that happens, that's going to have gigantic costs associated with it. And I think that there need to be more arguments that center around what what we are saving.
Hmm.
What, okay, yeah, this costs this, but it would save X number of dollars
Oh,
by not having
absolutely.
a giant catastrophe. Sort of like you could have made the argument that, yeah, the pandemic's bad, yeah, preventing a pandemic would be very expensive, but it's more expensive having a pandemic. And it's sort of that same idea. And I think that there's real value to looking at the way that people talked about COVID and applying it to things like climate change, to seeing where the failures were, where the messaging kind of came short, where the how misinformation spread. And I think that over the next several years, that's going to be important to apply to things like climate.
No, absolutely. I know you talk about the profiles you've written. You've written a lot of great stuff on social media and the companies and their policies on misinformation. What worries you the most now about the way social media companies are handling misinformation on their platforms?
I think there's this fear. It's the same sort of idea as it comes to regular media, is this like the fear of being called liberal or fear of being called left or biased against conservatives. And with Facebook, for instance, they came out and they did something good at a certain point when it came to COVID coverage. They said misinformation, we're gonna shut it down, and then they didn't really follow through on that. Same thing with YouTube and Twitter, because conservatives started complaining, saying it has a little banner saying that this isn't accurate. That's censorship, which doesn't make sense. But I think that as long as companies are willing to cave for the sake of this sense of false balance, that we're in for a really rough time. And it's been true for, it was true for network TV. It's true for cable TV, for radio, for websites, for social media platforms. This playbook is the same every single platform. It's accuse the platform, accuse the outlet of being biased, and no matter what they do, they're still going to be called biased.
Mhm.
In 2016, Facebook got some bad press when it came to someone wrote a story that said that they were discriminating against conservatives in their trending topics or something along those lines. And conservatives freaked out and they said, this is bias against us and we need to fix this. And so like 30 of them went and had a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, and then they made some changes to how Facebook handled news. And if you look back at some of the stories from around then, it was chaos.
Yeah.
They got rid of the human curators of the trending topics and replaced them with just an algorithm, and it immediately started pushing back all of these articles from websites set up in Macedonia to just misinform people. And then after the election, Republicans still said, you're biased against us, and it's just kept going, and
Yeah.
there's no amount of change that any of these companies can make that will fix that. And I think that we're sort of seeing more of that when I think that some places are starting to see that that's a problem. There was a really great article in the Washington Post last weekend by Margaret Sullivan, who wrote about a news outlet that is not letting people forget that there were some Republicans who were trying to overturn the election, basically. And they were saying, we thought that if we did the right thing, other outlets would follow, but it's been mostly silence. And I think that that's kind of the scary thing here. We've seen a lot of people move on and say, we don't want to talk about January 6th. We just want to move on. And, just today, Trump put out a statement saying that the 2020 election was fraudulent and it's like, what do you even do with that? How do
Yeah.
you fight back against this sort of stuff? And I think that as long as places are willing to go, okay, well, we're going to treat both of these as valid views, that we are in a rough spot as a society, not just politically, but just as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. We've agreed too much during this podcast. So just as we go out here, as we wrap up here, we obviously agree a lot on politics and climate. But Parker, there's one issue where we don't have any agreement, and that's NL Central Baseball. You are, of course, a
Yeah.
Chicago Cubs fan. The co-hosts of this podcast are diehard St. Louis Cardinals fans. I don't really have a question about that. You did have a great piece recently on MLB and the move of the All-Star game, which as a fan of baseball, it is nice just to see like one good move by Major League Baseball. We don't often get a lot of
rare,
those.
right?
It's very rare. But how are you feeling? I know the Cubs, off to a bit of a rough start, but how are you feeling so far with this 2021?
They're off to a bit of a rough start, but you know what? I'm really happy about Chris Bryant. Chris Bryant having a great year. He deserves it. Chris Bryant comeback season, it's going great. And just because of that, I'm sure they're going to like trade him right before the trade deadline and everything's going to go to hell. So, I mean, that would be, the life of a Cubs fan. It's nice. I feel like I'm back to normal, back to being like, well, the team is nonsense and garbage, but I love them anyway. So that's where I'm at.
Well, you're so kind to do the podcast, even though we're horrible Cardinals fans. But for our listeners who want to follow your work online and Media Matters for America, where can they find your stuff online?
Sure. You can go to mediamatters.org, and you can read all the people who are smarter than me, who are know more about climate change than I do. And you can also follow me on Twitter, where I just kind of ramble and say whatever's on my mind and sometimes get myself in trouble for it. So on Twitter, that's at Parker Molloy, ParkerMolloy.
Well, Parker Molloy, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.